So it's kind of like you basically cut off that proprioception between the brain and the muscle loses its ability to contract and contract on demand. And that you no longer have stability. You may have flexibility, but you no longer have stability in the joints.
Welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. I'm your host, Lee Brandon. This work started for me several decades ago when I started to see the impact I could make on people, helping them to identify the root cause of their health problems that no doctor could figure out, including serious back, knee, shoulder and neck injuries, acne and eczema issues, severe gut health problems, even helping couples get pregnant after several IVF treatments had failed. And it really moves me to be able to help people in this way. And that is why I do what I do and why we have this show. In this week's edition of the Radical Health Rebel podcast, entitled Why Yoga and Stretching is Causing Your Pain, Yogi Aaron and I discuss the important topics of stretching and yoga, why their concepts are often misunderstood, and why in many cases they are used ineffectively, leading to physical pain and injury. We both discussed our previous lower back injuries that were at least in part caused by yoga and the lessons we both learned. We also discussed the technical aspects of when and why stretching and yoga can cause pain, and we discussed how Aaron adapts his yoga teachings so that yoga can be performed in a way it was originally intended, which is to move with least effort, and in a way that helps to reduce the likelihood of pain and injury. Yogi Aaron, welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
It's great to have you on finally. So,
yes.
Aaron, could you kick things off by sharing with the audience an overview of perhaps your career to date, including why you started practicing yoga and why you started teaching yoga?
Okay, how long do I have?
You have as long as you want.
I'll try and give you the Reader's Digest. So
Sure.
I started yoga when I was 18, and I got into yoga like a lot of people do because I was very tight and not very flexible. I was a very athletic kid. I snowshoed, dog sled, canoed, volleyball, cross-country running, you name it, I almost did it. And I always kind of prided myself in being in shape at that age, especially. And then I started to feel like very constricted. So I got into yoga to stretch. I thought, well, I can kind of kill two birds with one stone, do something spiritual and stretch. And you know, like probably most people, it was very much an ego-based journey. I really wanted to touch my toes. I really wanted to put my foot behind my head. And so that kind of led me into Ashtanga yoga, which is a very rigorous style of yoga, practicing yoga postures. But one of the things that happened very quickly at the beginning of that journey is I really hurt myself. I started to hurt my back. And all the yoga teachers that I came across, I would tell them, oh, I've got back issues. You know, I started to identify as someone who had back issues. And all of them would say things like, oh, you need to open your lower back. You need to open your hamstrings. I mean, I look back at that. Well, that's a whole other discussion, but they would use that kind of language that doesn't really mean anything. But at that time, I thought, okay, now I have to become more flexible. I have to stretch more. And so I did, but then I would hurt myself more and more to the point where, you know, just kind of bending over to pick up a drop pair of keys, for example, I would hurt my back. I would throw my back out. My back would seize up. Just doing simple tasks would all of a sudden tweak something. So that's on one side of the story. The other side of the story is that I got really serious by the time I turned 28 in yoga. I moved to New York. I started a yoga practice there. That led me to opening up a yoga studio. and which is a whole story in and of itself. And then I met my business partner, and we decided to open up a yoga retreat in Costa Rica. So we officially opened the retreat in January of 2010, and that's where I'm based now. My story kind of culminated by the time I turned 45. I ended up in a surgeon's office, an orthopedic surgeon's office. I was in so much pain. I mean, we talk about, there's different levels of pain. This pain was so debilitating that I could barely walk. I mean, I remember when I made that final journey into the hospital that I was going to have a procedure done where they put anti-inflammatories injected anti-inflammatories into my spine because it was so inflamed. I just couldn't walk. And I remember it took me like a long time just to take these, little baby steps to the emergency room. But he said to me that you will probably need a spinal fusion in your lower back. You are a perfect candidate for this. And that really was sort of a wake-up call for me on so many levels, because here I was, the great yoga teacher. I knew so much about the body, or at least I thought I did. And, international yoga teacher. And here I was at 45, completely the antithesis of what I was preaching, what I was talking to people about, attributing the marvelous effects of stretching and doing yoga. And that was kind of like a moment for me to go, okay, I don't really know as much as I thought I did, so I need to learn more. And that journey took me into understanding biomechanics, muscle function, understanding the basic principles of muscle function, and understanding like we need to get the muscles doing what they're supposed to do. And stretching is doing the complete opposite of what they're supposed to do. And that's kind of led me to the journey of where I am right now speaking to you.
Cool. So how long was it between the time you started practicing yoga to the point when you started to feel pain?
Right away. I remember when shortly after I started, quote unquote, stretching yoga, because I just want to kind of state something, that I am a real big believer, if you want to use that word, in yoga, the philosophy, the practice. What I don't agree with is the stretching part of it, but that's a whole other conversation. So I just kind of, when I say sometimes yoga, it's interchangeable with stretching at that period of my life. And so when I started doing the stretching yoga, I remember one day I was moving my body. I was doing some, moving things around, and all of a sudden my back seized up on me, and it was like 18 at the time. And it was like a moment where I felt like, oh my God, I'm 18 and now I'm old. Because, when your back seizes up, you have such limited mobility. I didn't understand why that was happening. And of course, the solution was to go and stretch more, which was not the right thing to do. So I was 18, like right away it happened.
So you say you were 45 at the time you were sat with the surgeon.
Yeah.
So did you struggle with pain from age 18 to 45, or did you have kind of like good times and bad times?
I would say that in the earlier years, I didn't struggle with pain as much. I always had lower back problems though. And I just kind of attributed it to, I need to stretch more. Nobody said to me, you've got back problems because your muscles aren't working properly down there, and then showed me how to do that. Nobody ever taught me what proper muscle function is. And I kind of want to just state something, that when I say nobody, I'm also including people in the fitness industry. And I find that there's also, equal amounts of ignorance in the fitness industry as there is in the yoga, quote unquote, industry as well. And I had, because I had personal trainers, I worked with a lot of people. I've invested my whole life into understanding my body, understanding biomechanics, understanding because I've always known that I would live a long time. And I think that's kind of a truism for most people in the Western world. We're going to live a long time. And so how do we want to live? And I've always tried to take care of myself so that way I could always have a functional body as I've gotten older. And what I started to see, Lee, is that my body and biomechanics got worse and worse and worse over time, which was not a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I took up Bikram yoga for about 18 months. And when I first started doing it, it was partly because, like a lot of guys that, work out a lot, we tend to get quite tired. I mean, I use corrective stretching with clients. I've been doing it for 22 years. I kind of know how to stretch properly and how to strengthen muscles that are weak. But I did it because I thought, I might just loosen me up generally. But I also just enjoyed the heat and I enjoyed the sweating. I thought it's good detoxification. And I would do it as more of a recovery from my weight training and playing tennis. And at the end of the 18 months, I ended up with a herniated L4-5 and L5-S1 disc. Now, I'm not putting it completely down to the Bikram yoga, but it definitely contributed.
Yeah.
And, looking back, there was definitely times when, the instructor was encouraging me to go to places my body didn't really want to go.
Yeah.
So I guess I've been through a similar experience as yourself. There's definitely a link between yoga and back pain for both of us. So going back to your story, was there a moment where you thought maybe it's the yoga that's causing the problem?
I think that there probably was. I have an acupuncturist that I see quite a lot, and he actually lives in Costa Rica. He's not Costa Rican. He's from Texas, but has citizenship in Canada. And he has very extensive acupuncture training. He's an amazing acupuncturist. But one of the things he kept saying to me was, Aaron, you need to stop stretching and start activating. And he always kind of specifically was talking about my glutes. Mm-hmm. He says, your glutes have nothing. There's nothing to your glutes. And he would palpate my glutes and go like, there's just nothing here. There's no tonification at all. And I would be like, what are you talking about? Like, I do lots of stuff. And I never understood it.
And that's very common, isn't it, in yoga instructors?
Yeah, and then of course, it's challenging on my own ego as well. What are you doing telling me, something about my body? I know better, sort of thing. Because in yoga, one of the catchphrases you always hear is like, trust your body. Your body knows. Well, you don't even know how to listen to your body, let alone understand what your body really needs. And so there's a lot of, ego around it. And so that I was, very egotistical, but I started to read more and more about the detriments of stretching. And I started to take certain things out of my yoga program, even before I ended up in the surgeon's office. But I was still in that mindset of, if I'm not teaching stretching, then how am I going to teach yoga? And that's, I think, the hardest thing for people to kind of bridge in their own mind. They don't understand that in the yoga tradition, in all of the yoga scriptures, there's not ever one word of flexibility or stretching. Like, it's never mentioned. It's something that we've kind of extrapolated in a very, I'm going to use the word perverted way. By saying that we need to stretch is perverting the practice of yoga, because the two have nothing to do with each other. But if you asked a million yoga teachers, you would be hard pressed to find a few out of that million that would not be able to separate yoga and stretching and say, no, they have nothing to do with each other. And so intrinsically, now they might say it on the surface, and you see that a lot with a lot of yoga teachers, that they will say, oh yeah, yoga has nothing to do with flexibility. And then they'll go into a pose that demonstrates how flexible they are, or they'll put their foot behind their head. Yeah, yoga has got nothing to do with flexibility. It's all your own practice. And so there's a lot of incongruencies around the way that we communicate what yoga is. So to answer your question, it took me a while. It wasn't like, and I think it was ending up in the surgeon's office that made me like, okay, this is not working for me anymore.
Okay. So you brought up a really interesting point there. So I think I have to go and ask you more about that. So what is yoga?
Yoga is fundamentally a practice to help us separate ourselves from our own pain so that we can understand who we truly are at our core. And the Yoga Sutras kind of begins, and this is sort of a loose translation, a loose take on it, but it's there if you look hard enough. It says that we all have a purpose in life, that we're here to fulfill life's purpose, but we're in our own way. And so yoga is the process of separating ourselves from everything that's getting in our own way, which is ourself, right? We're separating ourselves from ourselves. And so a lot of people think that yoga is, oh, we're all one and we're all union, and because the word yoga means union. But in Samkhya philosophy, it's actually we're practicing V-yoga, which is the practice of separation, to separate ourselves, ultimately to separate ourselves from our pain. And our pain is anything that's not intrinsically who we are. So it's a hard concept for people to wrap their head around, which is why we have to practice, do the practice. So that's it in a nutshell.
So where do the yoga poses come in then?
Well, the yoga poses in the Yoga Sutras specifically, the yoga poses don't come in until really in the second chapter. And Patanjali uses this word asana. And so we translate asana as pose, yoga pose, pose. And so anytime you see like the name of a pose in Sanskrit, it always ends in asana. So Trikonasana, triangle pose, right? But the actual translation of asana is actually seat, to be seated. And so Patanjali is actually talking about a seated pose. He's not talking about how well can you do downward facing dog. And so he was saying to us how to practice. He was giving us instruction in how to sit properly. He said, sit properly by becoming as still as possible and to become as comfortable as possible. It breaks my heart. Sometimes I ask people, why don't you do yoga? And one of the responses I often get is because it hurts too much. And that's the complete antithesis of what yoga should be. So we have, there's when we see asana, but then, around, I think it was around 500 AD, we started to see there was a yoga group called the Nath cult. And I'm sure that there were other cults and other groups before that, but this is one of the most dominant ones that I know of. And the Nath cult was interested in understanding how to access the divine, God, our highest self, through the body. So Patanjali was saying that we need to calm the mind to understand yoga. The Nath cult was saying, no, we actually can experience the divine through our body. And they started to understand that if we breathe a certain way, if we hold the body a certain way, that we start to move energy through the body. And as we move energy through the body, it has this profound effect on our mind. So we see things so the example of the Nath cult is in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which has all of these yoga poses in it, which people look at, and we've kind of, extrapolated yoga. But if you read the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which most yoga teachers haven't, again, if you take 1,000,000 yoga teachers, you'd be hard pressed to find, 1% of them that have actually read the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is quite interesting. But in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, there's things like, if you do this twist, the energy at the navel center increases to such a capacity that it moves up into Bindu, and the yogi is enlightened. So they had a very deep understanding of how energy was moving and what we need to do to, get that energy moving. And that's why people feel good ultimately when they do yoga poses, because this energy, this life force, this prana is starting to move. And so that's kind of like scripturally where we see asana. But again, there's no word using the word stretching or flexibility.
So based on what you just said, what I'm understanding is, yes, there are poses, but no one's ever, the original scriptures never said, take it to your maximum.
None of them ever said, because the word sukha is there. Sukha means like effortless, to have ease, to, be effortless. And yeah, there's no like, take it to the maximum.
So where do you think that concept has come from?
Oh my God. I have a few pet theories about that. I mean, yoga wasn't really popular until around 1890, 1910, 1920. There was a man named Krishnamacharya who was really the first influencer. I'm really not kidding when I say that. He used to get in his oxen and cart and go from town to town, and he would do yoga demonstrations, and he would put his feet behind his head. He would do these incredible asana demonstrations, but he would also do other demonstrations too. He would do things with his body. He was known to like lift cars. He would perform all kinds of quote unquote yogic feats. And he then had students, and one of those students was Patabi Joyce, who is this, developed Ashtanga yoga. One of his students was Mr. Iyengar, who developed Iyengar yoga. And these people just kind of went out and really exploded what yoga is. So that's kind of one side of it. And Patabi really developed this huge following, which then his followers brought this sort of kind of power yoga to the West. Now, when you hear the name power yoga, who doesn't want to become powerful? Right? So there were really, the marketing around it has been really good. But where I really see the whole quote unquote stretching thing coming into play, I kind of blame, there's a few people to blame, but probably at the top of my own list is Jane Fonda. Because, we saw yoga kind of enter into the mainstream because of people like Jane Fonda, who did these beautiful videos in leotards and, leg warmers. And then we started to see it really enter into these, gyms. And all of a sudden, fitness teachers were called to teach yoga. They never did any training. They don't understand the spiritual practice, but they thought it was about stretching. And so that's what was, what they taught. So I kind of blame it really on local YMCAs and different gym studios, and from there, then the yoga teachers would then play music in their yoga classes, so that became a fad. And then we saw studios go, oh, well, we should be doing that too. And then, the studios started to change their format.
So it almost sounds like capitalism has completely bastardized yoga.
The capitalism and or just human beings messing things up like they usually do.
Yeah.
We always have to kind of like change something to fit our own projection of how we think the world should be.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I first met Amelia at a health club where I was hosting an event offering back screenings to the members. The first thing I noticed about Amelia was a dullness in her eyes, which I later realized was due to extreme pain, and I noticed that she was unable to turn her head and had to turn her whole body if she wanted to look in a different direction. Amelia informed me that she had a history of repeated shoulder and neck pain for the last 2 years and was diagnosed with spinal stenosis at C4-5, C5-6, and C6-7, and a stenosis is a blockage which in Amelia's case was in the spinal canal of her neck, irritating her spinal cord. She had extreme tenderness over her neck and trapezius muscles on both sides, and she suffered from severe neck pain continuously. Amelia informed me that she'd been advised that spinal surgery was the only option, but the surgery came with great risks, including potential paralysis, and no guarantee of success, which made Amelia fearful of the surgery. In addition to this, Amelia suffered from continuous exhaustion, painful intestinal gas and bloating, even though she felt she was following a healthy diet. After a thorough evaluation, I designed Amelia a corrective exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle plan, plus I referred her to a Nuka chiropractor for specific adjustments to her neck. After following the plan religiously, Amelia is much stronger and much more flexible than she's ever been before, and no longer suffers from repeated neck pain and has full range of motion in her neck. Amelia also reported that her energy was maximized and that she no longer suffers from the gripping stomach pains that had dominated her life for a very long time. If you're suffering like Amelia was and you'd like to find out more about getting to the root cause of your pain, go to www.bodycheck.co.uk, that's bodychek.co.uk, to request your consultation. So, in your view, how, to someone listening to this, how would you describe how stretching can actually cause harm to the body?
So, it's kind of a loaded statement, and, we can get into this as deep as you want to, but people, so there's a thing called proprioception, and that the brain kind of is connected to muscles, and there's communication going on between the muscles and the brain. You can kind of akin it to like a telephone line. Now, I live in Costa Rica, and as you drive down the highway, sometimes you see these telephone lines. They don't look in very good condition because of the elements, lots of rain, sun, monkeys chewing on them. So the telephone company has to come and replace them. And one of the things, so in our own bodies, what starts to damage that telephone line, and of course, we're talking about the nervous system right now. It's the nervous system. What starts to damage the nervous system is stress, trauma, and overuse. So if you keep doing a certain movement over and over and over, that overuse is eventually going to probably create stress, which will then traumatize that joint. And we see that a lot, in the fitness world, people that are, gymnasts, people that type at a computer all the time, they develop carpal tunnel syndrome. And so what stretching does is it adds to the stress. It is a passive, or it is a stress that is placed on the body that starts to disrupt that communication system between the brain and the muscle. And so what happens is, like, if you test somebody's muscle, for example, the glutes, we were talking about the glutes earlier, and if I get my glutes strong and I can test them and that they're strong. So in my lane or field of work, one of the things that we learn how to do is test force outputs of muscles. And when we say that, what we're really saying is that the muscle has an ability to contract and contract on demand, which is what a muscle should do. So if you bend over and pick up a pair of drop keys, that all the muscles in your abdominal area, let's just use that word for now, abdominal area, are shortening properly to stabilize the trunk and spine. If they're not working, if they're not shortening properly, then what's going to stabilize the body is the lower back. So coming back to the glutes, if I test my glutes, they're strong, I go and do a pose like pigeon pose, a very popular, famous yoga pose in the yoga world. And I go and then I test the glutes right afterwards. There's nothing. And so what happens is, when we start to stretch a muscle, we start to pull a muscle longer than what it's capable of doing in a natural state. So in that natural state, there's communication between the brain and the muscle. If we start to pull it longer than what it's supposed to be, the brain no longer knows where that muscle is. The proprioception is cut off. And I always tell people, if you want to stretch because you think it makes you feel great, awesome. But just know that you're basically taking a pair of gardening shears to the telephone line between your brain and the muscle, because you've got nothing after. And people are like, well, I don't believe you. Well, all you have to do is open your eyes in any yoga class. Watch people come out of poses like pigeon pose. They kind of they literally limp out of it because there's no connection to any muscle. So they're kind of like, basically kind of pushing themselves up and then collapsing on their back, because usually yoga teachers will do it before Shavasana. Good place to do it because they have nothing after that. So it's kind of like you basically cut off that proprioception between the brain and the muscle muscle loses its ability to contract and contract on demand. And that you no longer have stability. You may have flexibility, but you no longer have stability in the joints.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in my work, it's what is very important is to have a stable joint. You need equal tension of the muscles on either side. So if you've got one muscle that has a lot less tension on one side, and then the opposite side, it's got probably too much tension, then what you now have is a joint that's unstable. And once you start moving, because it can't stabilize, you're probably going to have excessive compression, torsion, and shear through that joint.
Yes. Very well put.
Now, if you look at anyone that's got hypermobility, many of them, after being hypermobile for any period of time, generally start to have joints that hurt.
Yeah.
And that's because they've got not enough tension on both sides of the joint. And now the joint is just, I wouldn't quite say flopping around, but it's moving too much. Now, when two surfaces rub against each other, what does that do? It creates friction. So you get wear and tear in the joints.
My teacher, Greg, always says, when you have flexibility, it's going to lead to instability, and instability will always lead to injuries. And I cannot tell you how many yoga teachers, I think it's one of the dirty secrets in the yoga world that nobody really talks about, is how many yoga people are really injured and need like shoulder surgery on their rotator cuffs. They need knee replacements, hip replacements, spinal fusions in their lower back. And we don't really talk about that. And one of the phrases that yoga teachers use a lot, I was talking about this earlier. Oh, you need to open your hamstrings, open your lower back. One of the most common phrases is open your hips. YouTube, open your hips, you'll get a zillion videos on how to quote unquote open your hips. And I always think, one day I woke up and I was like, that doesn't biomechanically make sense. If you think about opening your hips, you're going to dislocate your hips, which is exactly what yoga people are doing. Obviously they're not dislocating their hips, but they're creating such an instability in their hips that they need surgical intervention. And that's what I'm trying to start creating more conversation about, which is hard because they don't want to talk about that.
The hips is quite an interesting subject to talk about in terms of stability, because one of the things that I see a lot in my own practice, and something I really try and teach my students as well, is that, quite often you'll see people, they stand up straight and their feet point outwards. Okay, so why would that be? Well, if you understand anatomy, you'll know it's because the muscles that externally rotate the hip are tight. Well, the next question is, well, why are they tight? Rather than, oh, it's tight, let's just stretch it. Well, why is it tight? Well, there's one of those muscles called the piriformis, which crosses the sacroiliac joint, which is a very important joint for stability, particularly when you're walking and running. So if that's tightening to stabilize an unstable sacroiliac joint, the question is, why is the sacroiliac joint unstable? Right? Well, what stabilizes the sacroiliac joint? Well, the muscle that's too tight is doing that because some other muscle isn't doing its job.
Yeah.
Right? Well, one of them you've already mentioned, which is the gluteus maximus, works with its opposite latissimus dorsi to stabilize the sacroiliac joint. But then another group of muscles you've mentioned, the abdominals. So the transversus abdominis also, when it contracts, it helps to stabilize the sacroiliac joint. So stretching the piriformis is not going to fix the glute and the lat or the transversus abdominis, right?
Yeah.
And then if it is the transversus abdominis, well, what's causing that to not contract properly? Do they have inflammation in their viscera, right? Which can cause that.
Yeah.
So just saying open your hips is kind of really missing the point, really.
Well, and coming back to your herniated disc story, any time you open the hips, you're basically doing it in, a forward flexion, a trunk flexion, which is going to then exacerbate any kind of disc herniation as well. So not only are you messing up your muscles and lessening their force output, lessening their strength, weakening them, but you're also now creating more problems and more inflammation in the lower back, which is now causing more disruption in the communication system.
Yeah. and then you've got side bending as well, which will aggravate the disc even more. And then you've got rotation, which will aggravate the disc as well.
Yes.
I certainly, and this is really strange. And some people will say, well, why didn't you kind of understand what was going on sooner? There was a lady I used to always be in the same class as me, and she used to live near where I worked. So we would walk back together. And 3 times I said to her, when we do the side bend, it almost feels like there's a disc popping out of my spine. I said that to her 3 times. I had no pain. I had no pain at the time, but it was probably a few months later that all the symptoms came on.
Yes.
In terms of what you do now, so you've mentioned Greg Roscoff. So I know that obviously that's something that you've studied. Can you tell us a little bit about muscle activation techniques and how you got into it and kind of, what it involves?
Sure. So when I ended up in the surgeon's office, shortly after that, I realized I needed to study more. And I had been introduced to MAT, muscle activation technique, before I had somebody work on me that did it. And what kind of attracted me to it, what made me pay attention as opposed to going and doing some massage course, is that when my friend Eric, this guy Eric that worked on me, I would come into his office sometimes with pain, in my neck, in my lower back. And I've dealt with a lot of chronic pain even before I ended up in the surgeon's office. And I would always go in with 8 or, pain at a pain level of 8 or 9 out of 10. And after an hour or an hour and a half with Eric, it would always drop down to a 1 or 2. And that was very unusual. Like usually if I go to an acupuncturist, it might drop to a 5 or something like that. But with Eric, not only did it drop, it would actually get better afterwards. And it would also not come back until I messed up my body again or went back and stretched. So that kind of made me go, maybe there's something here. And shortly after I was in the surgeon's office, I went and spent time with Eric. And he actually did this demonstration where he got a muscle strong. It was actually my psoas. And then did a very passive stretch, like really passive and gentle. I barely knew it was happening. And then came back and tested it. And of course it was weak. And that was like the big light bulb moment where I think I realized I really want to learn more. And so then I said to him, should I go and do muscle activation? Do you think I would be a good candidate? He said, yes. So I really kind of entered into it with this kind of idea that I was just going to learn for myself and bring a little bit of the philosophy into my yoga teacher training somehow. I didn't really know how it was going to work out then. But as I kind of got into it, I realized I didn't know anything about the body, and it really fueled me to learn more about muscle function. And so what MAT is, we learn a diagnostic tool to identify where there's neuromuscular weakness. So we're not actually testing like how much weight you can lift. So when we say like a muscle is weak, we're not saying like, oh, maybe you could lift, bench press 200 pounds. But if I actually came and tested the pecs, in most bodybuilders, they would test weak. So we're not testing how strong you are. We're testing all the specific muscles. And are those muscles connected at a neuromuscular level? Is there that proprioception there? And so what we do is we have a diagnostic tool to test which muscles are weak. And then we go in and we can get those muscles, for lack of better words, turned back on. So a lot of us are walking around with muscles that are turned off. And that's why we have pain, because we don't have the stability of those muscles are not creating stability in different joints. So the result is then pain, inflammation in those joints. And so that's what we do in MAT. What I did, one of the very first things I realized very quickly is that there's nobody in the MAT world, quote unquote, that is a yoga person. I was like one of the very first few. And it just kind of prompted me to go, well, how can I weave this into yoga? If we're not going to stretch anymore, what are we going to do? And so one of the ways to turn muscles on, so there's the best way is always palpation, coming in and palpating the muscle at the insertion and origin, i.e. where they are attaching to the bone to stimulate those intrafusal muscle fibers. The other way is through isometrics and just kind of, working isometrically, and that will usually start to work on getting a muscle strong. So in the yoga world of asana, in the whole kind of library of asanas, many of those asanas actually are muscle activations if we use them, if we kind of change them a little bit. And an example of that is Shalabhasana, which is sometimes translated as locust pose, which you actually did in your Bikram classes.
Mm-hmm.
So lying on your stomach and lifting your legs and your chest up. Where we kind of turned it into a muscle activation is a little bit different. I think in Bikram, they just do it twice and they hold it for 10 seconds each time, something like that. Where I would kind of change it a little bit or tweak it a little bit is kind of really, instead of like saying to people, come up, come up, come up, I would just say, focus on squeezing the muscles in your lower back. So I would try and isolate the intention of the pose a little bit. And then the second thing I would do is do it 6 times and holding it for 6 seconds each time. And it's not so much about how far you can go. It's more about how much can you feel those muscles engaging. Another pose that we see in the yoga world that kind of crosses beautifully into isometrics. We're talking a lot about the glutes. One of my favorite yoga poses for the glutes is bridge pose. Very simple pose. But a lot of yoga teachers teach it passively, i.e. they put a block underneath the sacrum to get the hips up higher, which actually causes more damage in the glutes long term. So then again, you would lift the glutes up and again, focus on squeezing them and do that for 6 seconds and do that 6 times. So it's kind of like reshaping or what I like to use the word flipping the script. Instead of using the yoga postures to quote unquote stretch, let's start to use them to activate. And like another example of that is like in Trikonasana, you were talking about side bending before. And so in Trikonasana triangle pose, the teacher will always say, stretch out, push your hips out and bring your hand down to the floor. I would actually cue it to lock the hips. So squeeze the hips into midline so they don't move, cross the arms, and then bring your shoulder down towards your hip because now you're focused more on squeezing the oblique muscles on the side that you're bending into that are actually going to stabilize the trunk and spine. So that's kind of like how I started to take the stuff I learned in MAT. Obviously, I'm not doing MAT in my yoga classes. And that's how I started to develop a YAMA, applied yoga anatomy and muscle activation.
Yeah, I like that. That sounds good. I didn't want to stop your flow, but I just say some people listening might not understand what palpation and isometrics mean. So obviously palpation is touching the muscle. Isometrics is contracting it without any movement. So for instance, you might push against a wall. That would be an isometric contraction of your chest, let's say.
Yeah, sure. Or just, without weights per se. Well, you could do isometrics, I guess, with weights a little bit, but creating like shortening a muscle as well and holding it there for a specific amount of time without like an increased amount of load too. So doing like Shalabhasana, lifting your chest and legs up off the ground, thus shortening the longissimus and the other lower back extensors.
Yeah. So you call your technique Ayama?
Yes. Applied yoga anatomy and muscle activation. I didn't actually think of the word Ayama. That didn't come for a couple of years. It wasn't until somebody on my marketing team turned to me and she said something about like, tell me more about a yama. And I looked at her and I said, what's a yama? And then it kind of got me thinking when she said, oh, it's your thing. And I actually looked at the word and I realized it's a Sanskrit word, which loosely translates to unrestrained power. So it's like the opposite. Yama is like when you contain your power. A yama is when it's like unrestrained.
Perfect. And how have you found using that with people? What's the results been?
Well, when I came up with applied yoga anatomy and muscle activation, it was really more for my own yoga teacher trainings, the way that I was going to start teaching, and to kind of build in sort of an anatomy curriculum into my own yoga teacher trainings. My own yoga teacher training was really lacking up until that point in a good anatomy section. But I also just want to state for the record that you're very hard pressed to find a good anatomy training in any yoga teacher training. That's why yoga teachers say things like open the hips. But what I started to find almost immediately when I was leading yoga teacher trainings was somewhere around day 6 and day 10 that people were their issues, their pain issues were disappearing. They would be gone, like I said, somewhere between day 6 and day 10. And that was when I started to realize I need to kind of put this out in a bigger way and start creating more conversation about it. But I've been very amazed to see that when people start doing this, that they just get rid of pain in their body, and because they start to improve the function of muscles in their body.
And it's quite a subtle difference, isn't it, really, in terms of, focusing on contracting the muscle rather than trying to stretch the opposite one. It's quite a subtle difference in terms of the instruction, but, from what you're saying, it's got a very, very different result.
Well, yeah, and also people are becoming more stable in their bodies. And I think like one of the things that you just said, focus on stretching or engaging the muscle rather than stretching the opposite one. And then you kind of made another comment about that earlier. And I want to just kind of say, like, that's one of the biggest kind of puzzles that I'm completely curious about, because you and I, when we were in grade school, we learned the function of muscles. We learned that in order for our skeleton to move, muscles have to shorten. They have to shorten. But as a reciprocal effect, another muscle is lengthening. So if I bring my hand towards my shoulder, my bicep is shortening and the tricep, as a reciprocal action, is lengthening. And we, as yoga teachers especially, but even in the fitness world, I'm always puzzled by how we've forgotten that basic principle. And so we've gone from, oh, well, if I need to bring my hand to my shoulder, I need to improve the function of my bicep. But instead, we've kind of gone, well, if I want to bring my hand to my shoulder, I need to work on stretching the tricep. And that's kind of basically what's happening, which is very counterintuitive. And it shocks me that people are so resistant to understanding that basic kind of, I'm going to say, biomechanical fact.
Yeah. So far we've given stretching quite a big bashing so far, but would you say there's a healthy way to stretch? 42-year-old Chris came to see me whilst training for his first marathon. Initially, Chris wanted manual therapy on his calf muscles, which were taking a pounding from his long runs. I did recommend to Chris several times that he really needed a full exercise, nutrition and lifestyle program so he could complete the marathon in the quickest time and to minimize his likelihood of injury. However, 6 weeks from his first race, Chris suffered a debilitating back injury that meant he was unable to walk and was devastated that all his hard work had gone down the drain. Chris hobbled into my treatment room the next day to see if we could salvage the situation. I suggested to Chris that he do what I recommended all along, and if he did, he'd probably have a 50% chance of completing the marathon. So I've gave Chris a full physical assessment and then devised a comprehensive exercise, nutrition and lifestyle program. And full credit to Chris, he gave it 100%, totally dedicating himself to the program. Days before the race, Chris came to see me for a final tune-up and to ask whether I thought he was ready for the race. I suggested he start the race, but to stop if he felt any back pain, as there will always be other races. I received a text message from Chris the afternoon of the race to say that he completed it in 3 hours 42 minutes, and he had no pain and had little to no muscle soreness. Chris has since gone on to run multiple marathons in impressive times. So if you're suffering from back pain that's preventing you from doing something that you love, why not arrange a consultation with me at www.bodycheck.co.uk so I can show you what's causing the problem and how you can get back to performing at your best. Now, back to the podcast.
Well, we're kind of getting into murky waters. For the sake of stretching, I would say no, but there's kind of like two things. There's two buts to that statement. The first but is you and I both have suffered from herniated discs. And one of the ways that I actually have a herniated disc also in my neck, which causes a lot of problems. So interesting, it's neck and lumbar spine for me. But one of the ways that I've healed it is my chiropractor has one of these extension tables. And it's a really great extension table, but that in and of itself is stretching. And I remember the last time my lower back was in trauma, which is an interesting story in and of itself. Kind of what led to the trauma. I'm very aware of now what can traumatize my lower back. And when he put me on it, I remember the first two times after, when my lower back was traumatized, and he kind of increased the tension level a little bit so it would open up more. So basically what it's doing for your people listening is it pulls the spine apart in a gentle way, by the way. It's not it sounds painful, but it's not. It's actually quite delicious. But it pulls the spine apart, thus creating space for the disc material to go back into the spine. But I remember the first few times he did it after my lower back was traumatized. And he said, okay, come and, get up and move over to my other table. And I immediately got up and my lower back, it felt like it was about to seize, like tighten up, because none of the proprioception was there. And that was like an affirmation for me to go, oh yeah. And he actually said to me, yes, you don't have any proprioception in your lower back and probably even in my trunk flexors as well. And so he said, just give it a moment so it will start to come back a little bit. So I think like in those kind of moments, like there is a place for stretching. But I say that very hesitantly because people, when they hear the exception, they often make it the rule. The other place is in this word, and I don't like using this word as dynamic stretching because, again, it's got that word stretching in it. And if you're doing dynamic stretching properly, you're actually not stretching anything. You're actually working on increasing the strength of the muscles that are actually dictating the movement. So an example of that, kind of what we were talking about with the biceps and triceps, if you're lying on your back and you want to stretch your hamstrings, quote unquote, well, what you really want to do is make sure that your quads are activating properly. So you can lie on your back and just bring your leg up to 90 degrees. And without using your hands, use your quads to pull the leg closer to you. And that will start to activate the quads and thus, for lack of better words, release the hamstring tension.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, what I would say is that, first of all, you did a little bit, you need to define what stretching you're talking about, I think. Yeah. And also when you're doing it and on what tissue. So, obviously I went through personal training, 27 years ago, whenever it was. And yeah, we get taught anatomy and we get taught stretching, but we didn't get taught, well, you can work out which muscles are actually tight and therefore potentially need stretching and which muscles are weak and therefore need strengthening. So that's the first thing. My teacher, Paul Check, says, the muscles are like spokes of a bicycle wheel. If the bicycle wheel is, it's completely round and straight, all the spikes are at their optimum length. Well, that would be like having a body with muscles with the optimum length tension in each of the muscles. But in the bicycle wheel, if you've got some spokes that are too loose and some spokes that are too tight, now you've got a wonky wheel. So if you've got a wonky wheel, you know you need to loosen the tight spokes and tighten the loose spokes to make the wheel, perfectly round again. And, that philosophy we can use with the body as well. So, it generally takes me about 4 hours to assess someone's physical body and their biomechanics. And at the end of that, I've got a list of muscles that I know are tight or facilitated. I've got a list of muscles that I know are potentially long or inhibited. And then you can prescribe a really kind of, laser guided way so that, because what generally happens is, and I don't really want to bash people, but if you go to, say, a personal trainer, they're just going to get you to stretch muscles. It might be the muscles that you've just worked, but it won't be, right, let's actually find out what the body needs and then let's give it what it needs. The other thing is, that I think is important as well, is what kind of stretching you do at what time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to go and do, a sports event, the last thing you want to do is a yoga class or long static stretches, because then, like you were saying, you're switching off those muscle spindle cells, sending signals back to the brain. You're switching off that proprioception. Now the brain doesn't know what's going on once you start moving, and then that's when you're going to start tearing muscles.
Yeah.
However, what I would say is, if you're just about to go to bed, that will be a good time to stretch tight muscles. However you want to do it, like, as you said, if you want to stretch the hamstrings, why not contract the quad? That's definitely going to help, right? Because you're going to get that reciprocal inhibition of the hamstrings. It's going to allow it to move further, or allow the knee to extend further. So I think it's really important to kind of differentiate, what do we mean by stretching? Let's look at the different types of stretching, and at what time is each one appropriate, and are you stretching the right tissues? That's kind of my take on it.
Absolutely. And I would also just add that if you are going to stretch, like you said, you don't want to do it before you're going to go and exercise. In some of the studies that have been done and are being done, it's conclusively found that in athletes, and we're talking about athletes, we're talking about basically kids, like teenagers, probably people from the age of 16 to 22. So very healthy, probably somewhat conditioned, that when they stretch, their muscles shut down. And the studies have shown conclusively somewhere between 30 to 90 minutes. So if you're going to go for a run, the last thing you want to do is stretch your leg muscles before you go to run.
Yeah. And if you are going to do any kind of warm up, like, any kind of stretching type warm, you've mentioned it already, it would need to be dynamic.
Yes.
Rather than, long static holds, just moving quickly in and out, mainly just to get, some heat into the muscles, right?
Yeah.
You put tension through the muscles, it creates heat, makes the tissues more viscous. And it also, wakens up the nervous system as well.
Sure.
So what would you say is the ultimate goal? I know we've kind of touched on it, but what would you say is the ultimate goal of yoga, and how does ayama support that?
I think the ultimate goal of yoga is for us to manifest and live our life purpose. I think, as I said earlier, that yoga opens up the doorway for us to get ourselves out of our own way. That we have a purpose inside of us, but that purpose is covered by our own doubt, confusion, suffering, the list goes on. And so yoga is then the process of removing all of those self-imposed barriers And where a yama fits into this is that just from my own personal experience, that I know that when I've been in pain, that I've been not able to live my best life, for lack of better words. I remember I have memories of, like, when my back has gone out or my neck has gone out. I'm almost lying in bed for a week or two. And then after that, it's like moving very cautiously. And that's not how we want to move through life. And for me, living in purpose it's kind of multi-layered, but part of it is me experiencing life. And I was telling you, I think before we started the interview, I'm leaving for Italy to go on vacation. How horrible would it be for me to start my vacation with, a back that's seized up or a neck that I can't move? So for me, having a body that works ties right into living a more purposeful life at a very fundamental level so that we're not in pain. And that's one of the reasons why I've made up my mission to help people get rid of their physiological pain, not psychological. You need to go see a therapist for that. But physical pain and to help people start to be able to function better in life. Because I know from my own experience, like at the age of around 30, I had to hang up my hiking shoes. I started to get back into hiking a little bit, actually, after I ended up in the surgeon's office. And I was like, I really want to start hiking again. So I used my knee brace. But I was also doing all of these muscle activations. And over time, what I started to find is I didn't need the knee brace anymore. I was actually stronger at 47, 48 than I was when I was 30. And I didn't, I don't get bogged down anymore by those little aches and pains because my body works better than it did before. So that's what I want to impart for other people so they can live their best life and whatever that means for them.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, I mean, I've been helping people overcome pain for almost 22 years now. And the one thing that's really evident to me is that whenever someone's in pain, it puts limits on what they can and can't do. Whether it's go and play a sport, whether it's picking up their child, whether it's going to work, whether it's just sapping their energy, because it takes a lot of energy when you're in pain.
Yeah.
You're just not able to, as you were saying, live the life that you really want to lead. My mission is to help people lead a more fun-filled, healthy, productive and fulfilling life. That's my mission. But if you're in pain, it makes all of those very difficult.
I completely agree. And I that's what drives me more than anything. I literally just before this call, I had a message from a husband who wants his wife to see me. And unfortunately, I can't see her today. And he's like, are you sure? Like, she's in so much pain. And my heart was like, I should just cancel everything today because I can feel like I viscerally feel what she's going through because I've experienced that myself. And that's what drives me more than anything.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you see as the future for yoga?
I feel like it's going in two different directions. And I kind of want to just comment on that because you said earlier, like capitalism is sort of taking over yoga. And I look at that as kind of a negative and I look at it as a positive. You had mentioned that you did Bikram. What I have kind of observed is that a lot of people that got into Bikram at some point, usually, not always, usually if they're still alive, the practice didn't kill them, is that they kind of wake up one day and go, there's got to be more than just 26 postures. And when they wake into that moment, that's the moment that they start to go, there's got to be more. And I kind of see that in the yoga world now. People are starting to go, what more is there? Like, I feel like we're sort of exhausting, or we've exhausted, and we are still exhausting the possibilities of how many ways we can open our hips, you know? And I think that people are starting to go, this isn't working. I'm not happier. I feel sometimes better when I open my hips. You know, my nervous system is calmer, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not happier in my life. I still am, you know, have all the things really that were causing me suffering before, and they're still with me. So what is it? And I feel like there's a big kind of shift in some areas that people are starting to make that. And that's what excites me, is I feel like there's this kind of awakening in consciousness that people are going, what else is there?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, what we've discussed today is obviously we've been focusing on the physical, but obviously physical isn't all there is, right? Obviously that you've got the mental, emotional, you've got spiritual. How do you know, obviously yoga does involve those. Like, how, from your perspective, how does yoga kind of incorporate the mental, emotional, and the spiritual?
Well, I think it really depends on how far a person wants to go into the practice. When I'm leading my teacher training immersions, some of the feedback I get often was people didn't realize how deep into philosophy I go. And some people say that as a comment, as a good thing, and some say it as a derogatory thing. But usually at the other end, they're happy they got it, because people never hear this in regular yoga classes. Regular yoga classes are taught from the perspective of, we need to open our hips, you know, we need to prepare the body so we could do this advanced pose. Very seldom you ever go into a class and hear them talk about stiram or sukham, these two qualities of asana, for example, or the importance of practicing non-attachment. And what does that really mean, this idea of non-attachment? And so a lot of people aren't teaching the philosophy because it's just, they just don't know. They just don't know.
We also live in a world that's very kind of physically based as well, you know.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, you know, dealing with emotions can be too painful.
Yeah, I think also that the practice of yoga in and of itself helps to work through these things. But if we as yoga teachers can tweak our practices 1 degree, we can exponentiate the spiritual, if you want to use the word emotional, awakening, the possibility of awakening exponentially if we just tweaked it. I can teach, you were talking about side bending earlier, like one of the benefits of side bending on an energetic level is this feeling of becoming more open, and people intuitively feel it. You know, there's a sense of more ease in breath. There's more ease. There's a feeling of, wow, I just feel expansive. Now, if I talked about expansiveness and becoming limitless, then that's going to bring more significance and help people to even get more out of their limitations, if you will, or their box. If I bring in a bhavana and an affirmation to it, like an affirmation as simple as, I'm expanding my capacity, you know, and then you fill in the blank. I'm expanding my capacity for love. I'm expanding my capacity to be fearless. Whatever it is. Now you've just exponentiated the practice and completely set the table for, unlimited transformation and possibility. And so that's kind of where I come in and bring in, and these teachings really stem more from the tantric tradition. Tantra, a lot of people think that Tantra is the yoga of sex. And most people who get into Tantra yoga want to get rid of the yoga and just get down to the Tantra, the sex. But real Tantra, the tradition of Tantra, which, goes back 15,000 years, there's archaeological evidence to show that Tantra has been around for, more than 15,000 years, that the teachings of Tantra basically say, how do we bring more of ourselves to our life? And it's as simple as how many of us drive to work and then forget how we got from our home to work?
Yeah.
So Tantra goes, okay, well, how do we bring more of ourselves to our experience? And so when we're practicing Tantra yoga, really we're bringing more of our whole self to the practice through our mantra, our words, through affirmations, our imagination, through intention setting, all of this, and we weave it into the practice to exponentiate, the results, so that triangle pose is no longer, this side bending pose of how far can I get my hand to the floor, but more about how do I feel that I am now stepping out of my own limitations into the universe of limitless possibilities.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I just want to, before we wrap up, I'm just going to tell you a quick story that kind of highlights what you've been saying throughout the whole interview. And it's a colleague of mine tells the story, and it's someone he knows. I believe it was a yoga teacher, and they were invited to a Premier League soccer team to do the warm up before a match. Now you can probably tell what the end of the story is going to be. But let's say she only did it once, but 7 of the 11 starting players got hamstring injuries. Wasn't the smartest thing that that's ever been done.
I feel so bad for those soccer players.
Yeah, I think the medical team soon learned that lesson. They should have known better in the first place, really. But yeah, I think it was a few years ago. So, Aaron, what's next for you, apart from Italy?
Well, I'm about to go to Italy, and this is kind of going to be a nice few months of vacation. I haven't planned any interviews or any work. I might shoot a couple of videos because that for me is like tapping into my creative source. I love shooting videos. But other than that, it's just relaxation. And then after that, I come back and I'm going to kind of hit the ground running for the next year and see where I can take this Ayama stuff. My biggest goal, I think if I can distill it into one idea, it's just to create conversation in the yoga world, specifically in the yoga world, because that's my lane.
Yeah.
And hopefully start to create conversation around what stretching is actually doing to us and waking up a few people's minds.
Yeah, that sounds great. And where can people find you online?
People just go to my website, yogiaaron.com. Aaron is with 2 A's, RON. And I have a ton of free stuff there that people can access. I have a 7-day pain-free series. There's a lot of educational content there that people can access. Again, a lot of it is for free. And from there, it's a portal into my book, into my YouTube channel, et cetera, et cetera.
Awesome. Great. And I'll make sure all the details are in the show notes.
Thank you.
Aaron, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure the audience will have loved it as well.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure too. So that's all from Yogi Aaron and me for this week. But don't forget, you can join me same time, same place next week on the Radical Health Rebel podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to give the show a rating and a review, and I'll see you next time.